Hello, everyone. Welcome to Critics Live, organized by ArtsEquator as part of the Asian Arts Media Roundtable. My name is Nabilah and I'm from ArtsEquator. Today, we'll be talking about the show The Year of No Return by The Necessary Stage, presented at the Singapore International Festival of Arts, or SIFA. Critics Live is an open conversation for critics to discuss a recent work and open up a critical space to discuss the various responses to works of art, and of course, to invite you to be part of that conversation as well. Shortly, you will actually watch a pre-recorded video of the discussion that the critics, including myself, had on 22nd of May. That was actually one day after catching the live show at Victoria Theatre. And if you're wondering why we're watching a pre-recorded discussion when all of us are actually in the Zoom room with you, it's actually because, like SIFA, we've had to pivot because of the pandemic restrictions in Singapore. So the initial plan was that we would be able to do this live at the Arts House, which is like a stone's throw away from Victoria Theatre. But essentially, because of the restrictions, we've had to pivot. And as a result, we've actually pre-recorded the discussion, which we actually had like very soon after we watched the show. So it's quite, I would say it's quite immediate, our responses. And if any of you watched the VOD fairly recently, then you might have very fresh responses to that experience as well. So hopefully we can talk about that later on. So after watching that video, the critics, including myself, will be joining you for a live discussion, as well as take questions from you as part of the Q&A. So at any point in time, do leave your questions either on Facebook or on Zoom, wherever you may be watching this on, and we'll try to address as many of those as possible. I guess I will pass it on to myself on the video. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi everyone, welcome to Critics Live, The Year of No Return. My name is Nabilah and I'm the editor of ArtsEquator. We are a website that covers the arts in Southeast Asia as well as Singapore. Today we are joined by a group of esteemed critics, and we'll be talking about our kind of like responses to the play The Year of No Return by The Necessary Stage. So I'll do quick introductions. We have with us Clarissa Oon, who is a very seasoned critic who used to be with the Straits Times and currently is the head of communications and content at the Esplanade Theatres on the Bay. Hi Clarissa.
Hi Nabilah, thanks for having me.
And then we have Shu Yu, who is with Centre 42 and also used to write for Citizens Reviews, which is a Centre 42 platform for reviews, which used to run, I think, a few years ago. Yeah, so hi Shu.
Hi everyone, nice to be here.
Yeah, and last but not least, we have Naeem Kapadia. He is a critic. He writes reviews for his blog Crystal Words. He also writes for ArtsEquator, and we also happen to be together on a podcast with another critic, Matt Lyon, where we talk about theatre in Singapore, performance in Singapore as well. So hi Naeem.
Hi Nabilah, and thank you very much for having me.
So just to quickly contextualize what we're doing today, this is a Critics Live panel where we kind of talk about our critical responses to performances, and it's actually part of the Asian Arts Media Roundtable, which is happening actually right now and organized by ArtsEquator. And this year we're actually doing that in collaboration with SIFA, so the Singapore International Festival of Arts, and this play is being done as part of SIFA as well. And I also wanted to quickly acknowledge the fact that this year SIFA has had to really pivot because of heightened restrictions that are happening in Singapore. So because of that, there was actually reduced capacity of audiences in the theatre, and audiences also had to go through pre-event testing because of COVID, of course, for like health and safety of the general audiences for theatre. So just wanted to acknowledge like the circumstances in which we're kind of like being exposed to today. So very quickly to talk about The Year of No Return, which is the play that actually was supposed to be staged last year, but because of COVID, of course, had to be postponed. And I think we're all really glad to have been able to watch it live at Victoria Theatre yesterday, actually. And the play itself, to summarize, it's not easy to summarize this play, I have to say. In the style of TNS, there were a lot of things going on, but I think the main plot of it actually revolves around a global climate forum, which is kind of like an event that was being held digitally, like I think on Zoom or something that seemed like Zoom, hosted by Siti Khalijah Zainal as I think her character was called Sue. She was the kind of like the host who was like holding it together, and then all the other actors were kind of like guests or participants of that forum, that international event. So we had Ari, played by Lian Sutton, also a Singaporean actor, and he was like an activist who had left Singapore like about 10 years ago to do kind of like more hard-hitting activist work. And then now being granted a permit to actually speak in this event. And then the other actors were actually not on stage with us. They were kind of like beamed either live or like pre-recorded via video projection. So just to quickly run through who they were, there's Marco Viania, who is an activist who had actually lost his family in a typhoon in the Philippines and is now kind of like talking on the screen as part of that forum. And then we also had Dr. Maya Balan, who was played by KL-based actor Sukanya Venugopal, who also is like kind of like talking about her work in climate activism. And then the other two characters were kind of like more, I don't know whether to say comic relief or like kind of like the token like villains in a way. So we had Roddy Vera, who played Tony Manansala, like a politician type of like high-flying politician from the Philippines. And then we had Chihiro Hirai, who played a CEO of a kind of Japanese very big mega corporation, to round up the cast. I believe like that's all the cast, yes. And that's really barely scratching the surface. So let's start with Claire. Like, what do you feel? How do you feel about the play after watching that? Like, what resonated with you?
So I think on the whole, when I started the production, I was a bit skeptical because I saw all these screens and I thought, can actors on screens connect with me, as immediately as live actors? But I must say that I was pleasantly surprised. And the thing that struck me, one of the things that struck me was how the pandemic has transformed live theatre. So, I mean, much has been said about how theatre has pivoted onto digital and created new forms of digital theatre like Zoom theatre, which can be experienced in the privacy of your own bedroom with your laptop, right? But actually, live theatre has also changed with the pandemic. And I mean, that was what struck me when I saw Hex Theatre by Index on the Esplanade Theatre stage. Basically, it's like the audience members are lying down on the stage, socially distanced. It's a sound installation on a bare stage with just pure design and lighting and no performers. And it was a very kind of like intimate, also very disturbing experience about what the world is going through and what's going on in your head. And in a very different way, The Year of No Return also made me think about that. I mean, TNS is known for multimedia in its work, and what happened in this production was that the performers the foreign performers, international performers performing on screens, either pre-recorded or live streamed and interacting with another live actor in the flesh. I was quite struck by how some of that interaction was actually really powerful and broke through the screen for me. So, that was what to me added another layer to kind of like TNS's toolkit of like multimedia and devised performances. And I think the other thing also, if I think back to watching like TNS's intercultural theatre productions from 10 years, 20 years ago, like God Eat God, like Past Caring, featuring some of the same actors in this production, it's a long-standing collaboration, but how like their intercultural work has a newfound energy now. In a way, all the workarounds that all of us have been forced to do. I mean, I'm sure this production was created on Zoom. Alvin Tan has gone on record to say that it's the most difficult international production TNS has done. But I feel like somehow they've had to really dig deep into themselves and it felt, some of the scenes really felt fresh, and I felt like also it was a strong ensemble, and long-time collaborators having that synergy, that knowledge of how to work with each other, but really digging out something fresh and powerful in themselves to reconnect with audiences. So it struck me that, with this production, I felt like, intercultural theatre has a new energy with this kind of like hybrid model.
Yeah, because I guess TNS has like a devising model that they do. And I think part of the freshness for me was the fact, like, I thought it was really smart that they framed it within a kind of global event that was happening digitally on Zoom. So the moment you saw, the other actors kind of on video, it didn't feel like we were very distanced from them. It felt like something that we have been very used to for the past year, watching people on screens. And and it was actually comforting more than it was distancing. And part of like what was refreshing was the fact that, it is a kind of issues-driven play, right? About climate change, the climate crisis and all. But I felt like the fact that they contextualize it within the pandemic, right? So CTK and Lian Sutton were wearing masks. But it didn't feel like it was just like they are wearing masks because in Singapore we have to wear masks on stage now. You know what I mean? It felt like, because they are doing this, this kind of like event and they have to, and it's part of, it's kind of like baked into the plot of the play, I suppose. But Shu, what about you? What worked for you?
Well, actually for me, when it came to the themes, I was pleasantly surprised, and I was also very pleased to kind of see many different facets of like the global climate issue reflected throughout the play. So there was just also talk about like the pandemic, but also militarization and like the indigenous communities, how they deal with that, as well as kind of like that individual sense of helplessness against like systemic issues or systemic kind of like powers that be, that kind of restrict the way as human beings or as individuals, the things that we can do in the face of like the global climate crisis. So I really appreciated that it kind of delved into, maybe not delved, but touched upon certain sorts of perspectives. As well as like the presence of technology as sort of a bridging force or maybe a regulating force. So I really liked that there was kind of a variety of areas of discussion, if you will, right? And I quite liked that in the face of like all these big polemic statements, there were also moments of like honesty, such as during one scene where there was the character played by Lian Sutton, as well as like a character played by Rodi Vera. I think they're different from the characters that are named in a way. They are just kind of random activists, and there was kind of an honest confession that, yes, there are big things happening out there, but sometimes I can just barely get out of bed. And I thought that was important to acknowledge and important to witness on screen, because sometimes we're just helpless like that, right? So I really like that. I think that honesty was very important. But sad to say, I did feel a bit of a disconnect, because I think I struggled with this play because it was live. It was in a theater space. It wasn't on Zoom. So I felt like there was certain moments of disconnect when there was like filmic elements or on-screen elements that didn't quite tie back to like the stagecraft. So in terms of direction, it kind of felt a little bit flat for me. Like there wasn't a very good melding of different stage elements. I think I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
That's a good opening for Naeem to come in with what worked or didn't work for him.
So look, I think it was actually interesting, and I think for those of you who are familiar with TNS, the last show quite similar to this, which they did 2 years ago, was Civilized, where they were responding to, the bicentennial of Singapore's founding, and it was a very, I would say, kind of very complex, dense, messy play, because it just took a whole variety of perspectives about colonialism, past, present, and future, and it was at times a little bit difficult to watch because it just kept moving in so many different directions. Now, in contrast, this I thought was actually a very disciplined play. It was quite tight. It was quite reined in. I think it's 90 minutes. There was that framing device of the climate forum, which I think just helped to sort of create some structure. And I appreciated that. But I think that initial setup of having that forum made me think that, this is actually going to follow quite a linear plot. And then, it kind of
doesn't,
moves
yeah.
away from that, and you kind of go into all these individual stories. Now, you mentioned, Nabilah, that you actually were very invested in looking at the screen. I think for me, I was a little bit like Shu. I felt a little bit distanced at the end of it, because we are confronted with like these, bad corporate people and the politicians, and then these extreme activists. But then what about the average man on the street? How are you meant to feel about climate change? I just felt I was watching almost a documentary or a caricature at times, but I wasn't sure how I was meant to personally feel. And that's why I left feeling a little bit mixed. I appreciated the odd scene. I think the scene Shu spoke of really resonated with me as well, about the apathy we all feel. But at the end of the day, I felt a little bit muted, because I felt I was caught somewhere between the two extremes.
I think you mentioned civilized, right? And I think civilized for me was like, yes, there was a lot going on. It did feel like they problematized like the idea of colonialism in a way that was very thought-provoking in Civilized. And I feel like with The Year of No Return, they've chosen a kind of like a macro lens, I feel, on climate change. And so like on a micro level, definitely I felt engaged. I felt like I was super glad to be in a live theater, just watching a live show. But it did feel like you were watching, you were a spectator, kind of like not, and I felt like I was at however I felt about climate change going into the theater, I felt kind of the same coming out of the theater. I'm not sure how you all felt about your views about climate change, whether those were like challenged, or did you feel like awakened? Did you feel woke after the play? Yeah. Clarissa, what do you think?
I found certain points of connection in the play, but not necessarily about climate change per se. And actually, the more I think about it, I feel like The Year of No Return isn't just about the year of no return for climate change, but also for like issues of inequality, the state of activism, the notion of privilege. I felt climate change was sort of like the tip of the iceberg, and then all these issues were mine. And for me, that was the strength of production, rather than any kind of awakening about climate change. So the first scene the scene that sort of really drew me in was when Marco Viena, the Filipino actor, and I mean, all the time he's performing to us on a screen, right? I mean, I think some scenes are live streamed, some scenes are pre-recorded, but there's one scene where he's telling this backstory of how, I mean, he lost his family in a typhoon, and he went on to become a climate activist because, I mean, it just awakened in him how, I mean, in that rural part of the Philippines, that there's so much in which they are left behind, and the politicians, have not taken care of their interests by just focusing on big business industry and ignoring the state of the environment, right? But basically, it's a personal story. He lost his children, and it really touched me. I mean, as a mother, and he was also talking about how, I mean, he when he lost his kids, he wished that time could stop so that he could go back. He could be with them, but also that the clock is ticking, and this thing about the clock ticking, that was a running motif. You could also hear the sound of a stopwatch, literally, and it was a very powerful scene. And I felt there's this urgency, and that permeated into other scenes for me as well. And I think something that TN is also very good at doing as part of their social theatre toolkit is also flipping the subject positions. So while you are meant to feel for this activist, but then later on there's this a funny scene, like a kind of like a pity party where the Japanese CEO and the Filipino politician are commiserating about how they've become the bad guys. They're the quote unquote new oppressed, and it's like this karaoke session, drunken karaoke session over Zoom, and I thought that was quite a hoot, and I really wish there was like a full audience in the house to kind of enjoy, because I mean, it was also satire in a way, right? So I think it showed sort of different sides of the issue, and I felt I was able to connect with some of it and also laugh at some of it as well.
And I think like with Marco's that plot, right? Singapore was implicated, right? Because I think the mining company that was doing a lot of the work in his hometown was a Singaporean company. Did y'all feel like how do y'all feel about the Singapore kind of like element in this production? Because it is a very regional production because of the cast, because of TNS's history of working with these actors as well. I think it's also one of the plays that is co-written not just by Harish Sharma but Roddy Vera as well. Naeem and Shu, what do you all think?
So I think it's actually interesting, just as Claire was saying about the Roddy Vera character just being so moving. I found myself more moved by the characters.
Marco
Vienna, sorry. I found myself actually more moved by the characters on the screen rather than the ones on the stage. And interestingly, the City K character, who's this kind of very diplomatic, efficient Singaporean MC who just tries to kind of make sure that the event is running smoothly while not really expressing any feelings that she has. And then the kind of almost crazed, slightly comic-like eco-terrorist character played by Leanne Sutton, I didn't find them that engaging compared to the other two characters who I saw on the screen. And I'm not sure if it's just a comment on Singapore there, just kind of being a little bit, colorless perhaps in terms of the way we respond to these issues. That was the way I felt about how Singapore fit into the thing. We're just kind of there to provide like the financial backing and a nice cushy background, but like we're not really foregrounding and driving the issues.
Yeah, I mean, in comparison, right? I mean, we don't really have that many. As an affluent country, we are probably the villains in this story. So in a way, I totally.
If you're not the villain, if there's no villain, then you're the villain.
Yeah. So that we are that looming presence. We are the ones that are complicit in this whole event, and I think maybe seeing the different kinds of stakes that were put out there, right? The idea of like poverty and inequality, right? It's really like when climate justice happens, it's about like raising these people who say are not privileged the way we are. So in a way, there was the element of kind of, I did miss the Singaporean villainy in the piece, but there was also a very disarming kind of Singaporean apolitical presence, right? In Sue's character that couldn't really make up her mind, doesn't know which side she stands on, just wants to keep the event flowing, is in contact with the police, but also the activists. And I think maybe some audiences would find themselves reflected in that character. But I did want to see more of her. I didn't want to see what she really thought, and like I didn't want to see her struggle. And I feel that might have unlocked a bit more of a, I hate to use this word, but like relatability, but it also would round off the picture quite well, right, in seeing the everyday person there in a way.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in, I think that in an intercultural work that is produced in Singapore, there's always this sort of like, need on the part of theatre makers or consciousness to balance the Singapore angle with the international angle, right? And I think in this production, perhaps due to the fact that the co-writer is a Filipino actor, playwright, Roddy Vera, that actually some of the Filipino stories, the Malaysian stories, as narrated by Sukana Venugopal's marine biologist, some of these actually came out more strongly. And I would say that if I was struck by a specific climate angle, it would be the fact that the global nature of the problem, right? That it's borderless, and so I can be moved also by a typhoon in the Philippines, that sort of thing. But yeah, I would agree that the Singapore reflection or the reflexiveness of the Singaporean probably didn't come out so much. Like the strongest moment was probably when this corporate video on Singapore's green plan got hacked, right?
Yeah.
And that was quite fun. But basically, it's mocking our privilege. But then it's also like Singapore as a concrete jungle, as a land of parks. It's not really like where the front line of the battle for climate justice is. So there's that bit of that distance. So if, I mean, I think if as an audience member, you're expected to be provoked or challenged, probably there wasn't so much of it there.
Right,
yeah.
right. Maybe it was like a issue of like overcorrection almost, right? Because like we are Singaporeans who are producing the play, so then you feel like, okay, maybe we should kind of like give space to the non-Singaporeans and the kind of narratives that are a bit more urgent, right? Yeah, and speaking of like overcorrection, well, not really, but like, how do y'all feel about the ensemble? Because there was an ensemble of like 5 to 6 actors. Maybe not all of them were actors, but they definitely filled the space, and there were a lot of like physical scenes of them like walking, you know, across the stage and things like that. Shu, what do you think about them?
Yeah, they just filled the space lah, I think. I really wanted to see a lot more because, like, you know, it's so rare to be back in the theatre and feel the bodies on stage, see the stage picture get completed by these different like elements of bodies and then light and then set and sound kind of like gel together. But in terms of the ensemble, I was counting the number of scenes in which they would just appear and then stand for like 5 beats and then leave, that kind of thing. So I was a little bit thrown off that they were there, but they didn't really do much. You know, I don't know if that's like a metaphor for like these random general public. They're there, but they don't have a voice. Yeah, so I didn't really appreciate that they were okay. I guess they were useful in filling up and creating a sort of like they activated the space, right? Like you mentioned. But I think overall, for me, it was pretty flat in that they would appear and then leave. The only scene that I actually really liked was when, strangely enough, there was no multimedia. It was Leon Sutton's character and maybe not character, there was just Leon and the 2 dancers. There were also 2 dancers present in the play. And the 3 of them were moving to quite a fast-paced beat. And then in the background, you would see the ensemble kind of cross the stage. And halfway through, they break out of their usual formation and they kind of do some movement. And then like at the end of the scene, they kind of all rush out together. I thought that was really nice, actually, because then you had these multiple layers of like the lighting and then the beat reaching like a crescendo, and then it kind of introduced a very nice break into the heavy text of the entire play lah. And I really like that holistic kind of appeal of that scene. Yeah.
I didn't mind the multimedia. I mean, it wasn't the strongest thing about the production, but I mean, it also didn't jump out at me. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I also didn't mind, like Claire. I felt that, you know, if it was only CTK and Leon Sutton on stage, I would have felt very sad, like a lot sadder, you know what I mean? I appreciated the kind of like the warm bodies on the stage, even if, yes, they were underutilized and maybe some of them were not performers. So, you know, maybe there's some, you know, things going on over there. But I felt that it kind of like painted this issue on a broad spectrum of like, we are all, you know what I mean? Like, we are all included in this. You know, it's not just these people who happen to be part of this forum. It's everyone is going to be affected. And, you know, going back to the title, The Year of No Return, I think it's an actual term, right? It's like when things are going downhill from there. I think it's 2030 or something, but like we're meant to be doing something now. So maybe it'll be interesting to hear from the makers actually about what they were trying to go for with the ensemble, because it did feel like, yeah, maybe they were a little bit underutilized. I was thinking about like what y'all, I wanted to see like what y'all felt about the design elements, like maybe the elements of stagecraft. Because for me, like the depth of the stage was not used as much as actually the verticality of the stage because of the projection screens. Like the screens were moving, there were like multiple screens and they were moving, like they were moving a lot, and to kind of accommodate the, you know, like the dimensions of the video that was going to be played or something. I don't know. I'm sure there's a better reason why, you know, there's a kind of choreography of screens happening. But the activation of the space in a vertical level, like I was much more aware of that rather than the usual kind of like design elements taking up space. Yeah.
To me, I thought the production was technically strong. The interplay between the multimedia and the sort of like telematic performances, you know, where you have live stream and live actor, or, you know, pre-recorded, all that felt very seamless to me. I mean, I think one of the things we said, you know, when we were just chatting earlier, that yeah, we were moved by a lot of things on the screen and could we have just watched it at home on our laptops? Would have been better as a Zoom, right? But for me, I felt there was a certain power in it, being in a physical space and seeing this kind of different layers, the multimedia, the live actors, the also the interplay between live and a physical performer on stage. So I felt it was something to be watching it in a live theater. Yeah, not sure what the other thing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think definitely there was quite a good experience of just being, as you said, physically in the space. But I think for me, like Shu, I was really struck by that just wasted opportunity in terms of the 3 dimensions of the space. We have the verticality, as you mentioned, but there isn't the use of the space. There's an ensemble moving around, but technically they just are providing a bit of filler between the scenes, and they're not adding or really commenting on what's going on the projections. And for me, I think the projections were really, and this is again a hallmark of TNS. I mean, that was really a strong suit because they were very beautifully executed, crisp. They engaged us very well. There was a scene where the forum is hacked, and you have this sequence with Pee the Frog, and going with this rant about capitalism and inequality, and it was kind of incongruous but funny, and it just kind of got a reaction from even the very limited socially distanced audience. So you can only imagine how that would have felt in a packed stage. So I think they were hitting the notes with those elements there. I mean, I think perhaps we have to also be aware of the fact that this may not have been conceived of in this way, and I think I would be very keen to hear what the creators maybe had in mind originally, because obviously it had to be done in this hybridized form. If it was done with far more actors live, maybe the experience might have been different. But I think just commenting on that direct connection, I thought it was interesting to compare and contrast 2 scenes. One was what Shu was talking about with the 2 activist friends, and one is a bit apathetic and one is at the scene of a protest, and that obviously spoke quite strongly about this general apathy that we all feel with the pandemic. But then there was another scene which again is very characteristic of TNS, where you have all these actors, and I think that might have been live streamed, where the actors break the 4th wall and start addressing us. And I was completely unmoved by that, when they go around with all these platitudes like, how are you feeling today, and this and that. And that didn't work for me, but just that simple conversation between the 2 friends actually moved me
a
far
lot
more.
Yeah, it's quite funny that the meta moments didn't really work. I think maybe it's because we are already moved on other levels through all the other stories. So that moment where they're like, hello, and then you're like, who is talking? And so yeah, those scenes kind of fell a bit flat for me. We haven't really talked about the more absurd scenes. I was wondering what about the interludes, how that played for you all. So for example, there's the AI scenes, for example, right? So there's the Singapore AI, the Malaysian AI, and the Japanese AI, and they were kind of comparing notes about what they do to help each country with climate change, realizations and things like that. And they were quite funny digs at each other, Singapore being, I don't know, I can't remember what it was, but I think Malaysians being very feelings oriented and things like that. So that was quite cute. But how do y'all feel about the kind of the scenes that took away from the main action, I suppose, the absurd scenes?
I mean, I think the AI scene was not meant to be emotion. You were not meant to invest emotionally in it, but it was it's like an absurdist interlude, right? Which I thought was fine, and it was that added layer of inventiveness to kind of that all those layers playing out on the vertical screens. Yeah.
I think I agree. I really like those scenes of for example, the hacking video was very bright, very colorful, very in your face, and the AI one also very self-reflexive. I think I needed a little bit more of that color here and there in some ways, because after these scenes you would kind of go back to either the global forum, or you would hear from the characters, the Marco character, right, about basically the damage that climate change is happening, it's doing to you. So I really enjoy it, and I thought they were very effective devices to kind of break away from it, to kind of really also prompt the audience to consider different elements of like technology, as well as like the other conversations that are happening out there, like about like capitalism, or like about trolling, or about technology, or about the kind of conversations we have also on social media, in tandem with like real political discussion, not real, but political discussions in a very formal sphere. Yeah.
Maybe as a kind of like a last question, what were your expectations going into this play? Because I feel like, it is a heavy topic, and like Claire said, there are a lot of other issues that were baked into the plot as well, and into the play. What were your expectations going into it, and how did you feel kind of like coming out of this experience?
Well, look, I think this was kind of billed as the kind of marquee production of SIFA 2020, and I obviously was very excited about it even last year, and obviously it got postponed. So I think I had quite high expectations. It was a intercultural work. It was a collaborative work with artists from around the region, and I think, yes, there were these issues that were ticked off, but I think when I added them all together, I didn't really come out with any, amazing new insights, if you like. Whereas I think for some of the other plays, like I'm just thinking back to Underclass, for example, which was a TNS play from 2018, I think, that really kind of, struck a chord in me about privilege and, the economic inequality that exists even in a place like Singapore. But here, as I mentioned earlier, I feel like there were these extremes, the politicians and the big corporates, and then the extreme activists on the other hand. And then there's most of us, I guess, the kind of typical middle-class theatre-going audience, are somewhere in between. And there wasn't really a hook for me to kind of like hang my feelings on. So, I don't think I walked away with any radical new insights. I think it was great to be in a live theatre space, to see that fluid conversation going on between the live and the filmic, which they did very well, and which I think they handled, with grace and despite all the restrictions that the pandemic has brought. But I think this thematically, I don't think there was anything particularly strong for me that I took away.
Yeah, I have to agree with Naeem as well. But I think when I think about expectations, I split it into two. One is a bit more production expectation. The other one is a little bit more about content. So in terms of production, like knowing it's a SIFA commission, I expected a little bit more about, utilizing the 3D space, especially because it's TNS and they are, masters of stagecraft. So I expected a little bit more in terms of like, making sure that the coherent stage picture, or like, there was a little bit more consideration on that front. But I also knew that, like, content-wise, climate change is hard to talk about. Like, even when you're given the luxury of time and word count, like, rarely do people reach a conclusion that can satisfy the current urgent needs. So I also had to taper my expectations and understand that it's hard to talk about it. So I didn't come in with, like, overwhelming expectation. I think they touched on things that I expected them to touch on, which is great. But I also feel like, it's a conversation that we need to have in a more productive space with more deliberate, tangible actions in order to really manifest, taking back control over our planet. Yeah.
I think for me, so because of the whole sort of like, it's built as a production about climate change, and to me, climate change is it's a very big topic. It can be quite abstract. It can be, potentially intellectual and not something that people can connect with. Although there are ways in which it can trickle down to ordinary lives, but then, it could take a 3-hour film or a thesis sometimes to drill deep into those things, right? So I actually wasn't expecting very much. I was actually a bit apprehensive, maybe no doubt fueled by the PET and all that, like someone digging up your nose, right? I mean, so I wasn't expecting very much, and to me, I actually was pleasantly surprised. I think having seen the performers over the last 10, 20 years, in other intercultural work and all that, I was struck by what I felt was a new energy in TNS's intercultural work. And I saw it not so much as a climate change production per se, but really using climate change as like a lever to open up conversations on other things like privilege activism, inequality, and the state of the world today, the state of our mental health, our isolation, and all these issues. Yeah, and to me, I liked it much more than I disliked it. So I was glad that I went. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think the scene that we mentioned about the two activists, like what really worked was the fact that the one actor actually came off with a lot of empathy for the other actor, and I felt like that is what summed up the Year of No Return for me. It's like empathy for even like the making of this play, right? Because it wasn't just about utilizing the stage, it was also about utilizing the screen. And I think we acknowledged that the use of the multimedia and videos was like amazing. In fact, maybe to the expense of what was happening live. But I felt that it was like Claire, I kind of like fall on I was glad to have watched it. And I thought they did a pretty good job considering everything else. I feel like this is also a play that has to have a post-show discussion, which of course with the pandemic, like we can't. But with for our panel, we are hoping to get really a lot of questions from audiences as well as from the makers. Actually, we are hoping to see y'all as part to ask questions and to also maybe tell us if we are wrong and like way off the mark. Yeah. But so with that, thank you so much, the three of you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and we are hoping that you will ask questions in our live Q&A. So yeah, see you there and thank you.
Welcome back to the real world, I suppose. I have to say that it's a very bizarre thing to be watching ourselves critique a work, and for the audiences who couldn't see, we could see ourselves and we could see ourselves react to what we were saying. And I think I want to open that by saying, like, has anyone, shifted in what they're thinking about the show, having it been like 2 weeks since we first spoke about the work, right? And I think the interesting thing that I was realizing as I was watching the video is that was probably all of our first shows at SIFA. So we were talking a lot about being glad to be back, and just the kind of like first interaction with the festival as well. And I feel like that kind of empathy definitely powered at least my reading of the experience that I got. Naeem, how do you feel watching that back?
Oh, it's strange watching yourself, right? I think for me, the difference is that I now have had the chance to watch the video on demand, which is running until the 20th of June. And I have to say, firstly, SIFA has done an amazing job in terms of filming all of these shows. So you really get the close-ups on all the actors' faces. The actors don't wear masks as well, which allows you to appreciate the facial expressions a lot more. So for me, I think it just framed the action a lot better, whereas I think I was probably a little bit more distracted by perhaps the open space when I was sitting in the live theater and craning to read the surtitles at times. Just watching it on the screen and getting that perfect angle made it perhaps a little bit tighter for me. But yeah, I think fundamentally, it was, I think my thoughts are similar, but it was nice to revisit the show after almost 2 weeks.
Thanks for that. Naeem did his homework and watched both versions. The rest of us were quite naughty. We stuck to our the live experiences. Shu, what about you?
Firstly, it was just such a strange experience to watch myself and kind of like understand that I'm standing actually 2 weeks from that moment where I was reacting very like instinctively, very, very, still very filled with like the adrenaline from having caught the show live in the theater space. So I think largely I stand by what I said. I think that first visceral experience was quite important to me. But I think that's the beautiful thing about SIFA, right? Since that moment and in the past 2 weeks, we've had the chance to watch a lot more shows, whether or not video on demand or live or both. And there's a lot to kind of be said about the climate in which we're currently making work. We're making work about the crisis, we're making work in the crisis, and there are a lot of things that we have to deal with as theatre makers and as like audiences in terms of how we process that information. So I think by and large, I still kind of vibe with what my past self thought, but I do think that it's really opened up my eyes to the sort of limitations and the really fundamental question of how do we make that kind of hybrid work happen? Do we at some point get really good at finding that soft spot between video and live? Do we at any point in time trade off the live or the video in order to kind of prioritize the other? I think that has been a big question that has been in my head since. Yeah.
I feel like there's kind of like two ways of looking at it, or maybe two separate points, right? So one is the audience kind of, because of the pandemic, being very aware of the conditions in which work is made. And because of that, like as a critic, it definitely does feed into how we view the work. And like Naeem has done, like watch the VOD and then try to see like what were the different choices that they had to make, and maybe even the kind of compromises that they might have had to make in order to make one kind of like really sing versus the other perhaps. And then I think the other thing is from the perspective of the showmakers, like exactly what you're saying, like Shu, about the choices that they had to make that were maybe quite difficult. And because they have to make a choice, then do we actually penalize them for when something falls short? I think that's also the other thing. Claire, I think what I really appreciated from that discussion was that you really brought in a more like a historical view of like TNS's work. And I know that we also mentioned like civilized and things like that. Do you feel like in terms of watching that discussion right just now, like do you feel like any of that has shifted how you feel about the work, and maybe even the idea of how TNS's work actually translates on this big stage as well? Because I'm very aware that Civilized was also done in their black box. I'm not sure if you had any thoughts about that.
So, I mean, I think to your initial question about, or also Corey's question in the chat about, how do we feel? Have we changed our minds about it 2 weeks later, right? I've thought a bit more about it, and I've also found it very interesting, the very divergent views of The Year of No Return, also of other SIFA productions like Three Sisters. And I think on two counts, so I also saw Three Sisters on VOD, and it made me think about the multimedia treatment in The Year of No Return. So I mean, Three Sisters, the screens, they were really outsized, like the characters really dominated huge swaths of the wall, right? Whereas I think for The Year of No Return, for a lot of the time, maybe with the exception of Sukanya Venugopal's scene with the chorals, and just kind of like lyrical, and she was blown up really big, but most of the time they were quite small. And while I think the shrinking of the screens, I think it put off, alienated some people because they felt like it's less relatable. It's like watching, something on a laptop. But on the contrary, I felt actually that sort of like replicated the kind of energy of a Zoom environment. So that when you had to appear at the karaoke pity party, I kind of like I got into that vibe quite easily, and yeah, so I mean, in some ways, the comparison, I felt like TNS's use of the multimedia was much more integrated. But of course, it's not a fair comparison. They are very different companies. And I mean, TNS has a much longer history of working with multimedia compared to 9 Years Theatre, right? And the other thing that struck me was this thread which runs through a lot of our deliberations about where is Singapore, and how come a lot of the most powerful moments are actually the stories of the overseas activists, and where's the relevance to Singapore? And I thought about that. And maybe one thing which struck me is that, I guess, well, two things. One is that maybe in the current situation, particularly, in the time of COVID, where it's sort of shown that, like, unless you kind of fix an issue on a global level, you can't really talk about like domestic security, right? The borders kind of just like fade away, right? So I felt like there wasn't really a need. It may not have been a need for the play to dive into like a specific Singapore issue, to really like go deep to that, because in a sense that issue is borderless, right? And then the other thing also is that they did sort of like pose a question to Singaporeans, the Singaporean audience, but it may not have been felt as viscerally as some of the foreign stories. But the question is, would you as Singaporeans take a stand, right? Or are you just content to be the middleman organizing environmental conferences? And that was the
conundrum faced by Sue, and at the end she takes a stand, right? But how effectively that played out in the live space, that's another question. But I think the play did sort of have that kind of provocation for Singaporeans. I mean, to be fair to the production, yeah.
Yeah, I think for myself, like I definitely in this past few weeks, I've been thinking a lot about the Sue's character played by CTK, and how like even the fact that her face was concealed and her feelings were concealed for most of the show, just resonated with me as a Singaporean, like the one who is so plugged into all these, you know, kind of like discourses about this kind of like big issues, but often feel like we can't act. And maybe that was paralleled in the fact that she didn't do much like kind of like acting with her conviction until the very end. I kind of like have been thinking about that a little bit. But I think we can go to our questions. Hopefully, I think one of the thoughts that I had was actually someone disagreed with me about the idea of the masks being baked into the plot, and I was like thinking about it, and I think it's true, right? I can't pretend like, oh yes, it totally worked, you know, but I think for me it wasn't much of a stretch, especially when we think about the pre-show announcements. If you all remember Karen Tan's voice in the pre-show announcement saying like, oh, please sanitize your hands before you clap and things like that. I felt that definitely the pandemic was a big running theme of the production as well. A question from William. This production reminded me of Checkpoint Theatre's Displaced Persons Welcome Dinner, as the play focused on humanitarian workers. That was by Checkpoint Theatre. The Year of No Return spotlighted the activists portrayed in the play more than the intersection of multiple issues that Claire brought up earlier. So I think the question is whether or not it was really about the intersection of issues, or was it more about issues faced by activists, I suppose, in that regard. Claire, do you want to talk about that a bit?
I think it's both. So like the scene that Shu talked about, one of the issues the play raised, the production raised, is over this year of COVID, we've seen on the one hand more sort of like social political awareness than ever by ordinary people, you know, like with the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter protests and all that, right? On the ascendancy, and people just being more aware of the kind of structural inequalities in our societies, which have been heightened by COVID, right? And taking to social media, speaking up more, you know, all these things, right? But at the same time, there's also the flip side, which is activists feeling alone, isolated, who is in with them, and I think definitely both sides of that were reflected in the production. So on the one hand, you are made aware of the issues that, for example, in this issue of this whole issue of climate injustice. I mean, that there's a point in the play where the point is made that it's poor people in the poor countries who suffer the most, right? So I think you can't get away from that intersectionality either, and I think it was important that it was written by, you know, it was co-written by a Singapore and a Filipino playwright, so you had those sorts of perspective as an extension of Who's There, which Alvin had co-directed about last year. There's also this reflection on the state of activism, the current state of activism, its strengths and its limits. Yeah.
It could also be speaking to the kind of audiences we have for theatre in Singapore, like just the middle class. There was a question or a comment earlier by Max in the Zoom chat that was picking up on the term flatness. I think one of us used the term flat to talk about how it came off to us in the live show. And he said that, I feel that the choice of venue or stage kind of contributes to this, and the effect of doing it on the proscenium stage actually creates a sense that it's more of a presentation, and the show is critiquing the idea of this issue being presented on like the idea of the forum, and all the people are like kind of a little bit privileged, and like it definitely skewers the people of power, and even activists on some level. Maybe Shu, do you want to comment a little bit on this about the choice of venue as well? I think.
Yeah. I use that word to describe the flat, because I think when we were talking about the production, the four of us, we kind of acknowledged that, the experience of watching video projections in the live theater, especially now, is a little bit strange in that if you are focusing on the video projection and then you come back to the 3D space, you kind of lose that vertical space where the projection was previously on, and then you kind of have to, like, your eyes kind of go down to the stage space, where I remember quite clearly there were dancers that kind of came on stage after one of those scenes. I can't remember which scene it was, but there was a very distinct jump from that vertical space into back into that 3D space. So it felt a bit jarring to me in that way. So it didn't feel as harmonious as I thought it could have been, in that I expected a little bit more elements to kind of, populate the stage a bit better rather than kind of fragment it. I don't know if that made for easier filming or if, that was a conscious decision, which bears a larger question. But I do take Max's point that, that proscenium staging is also quite in your face, in that such a strange way to describe proscenium staging with the word in your face, but with the whole opening act, which is essentially the forum, right? It's like you're here, you're in attendance, you cannot back out now, you're in that conference and you're complicit, or you are supposed to be engaged. And I think that was quite I think it invited the audience to kind of confront, like, actually, you have heard a lot about these topics. What is your view? What is your stance? But I think on the other hand, it could have also been a bit of a primer for an info dump. So I don't know if it was Nabilah who mentioned this, but there were some scenes where there was also kind of a lot of research that was just kind of poured into the play because they had things they wanted to say. So they had to bring it out and kind of show that point of view. I think it was effective to a certain extent, but it certainly felt like there was a lot going on in terms of topic and content that audiences had to kind of absorb and then figure out where they stand after watching the show.
I think just to pick up on one of the things that I think maybe Claire and Shu, you might have mentioned about how we have to look at the subtitles, and then we have to look at the video, and then look at the live actors. And I think, like, it's quite funny because of the break in live performances, audiences now, like, we now have to relearn how to look at all these different things at the same time. Whereas I feel like we used to be able to do it. It's just that we've been conditioned out of it because of the pandemic, and now we're much more used to looking at screens. So as much as we talk about Zoom fatigue, I think we are having a bit of a fatigue of looking at live performances, and we have to relearn that actually as audiences. All right, a question from Kathy. The pandemic provided the framing of the work in visible ways in the staging, but could the work have cleaved the sense of the apocalyptic from the pandemic to pending climate change?
Quick response. I think the play did take a stab at that. I mean, the ticking clock, or the ticking stopwatch, right? That punctuated Marco Vienna's scenes and also subsequent scenes showed that in a way that this climate emergency is like a ticking time bomb, and there were other characters as well who were sort of struggling to convince their communities about the urgency of the issue, but were ignored. Or I think there was some sense of that for me, of the apocalyptic. Yeah, it was not absent.
I personally feel that the apocalyptic has already been drilled down our kind of like thoughts. But Naeem, what about you? Did you feel like the apocalypse was coming to the play?
Well, I don't think so, actually. I mean, I think you get markers that we are in a pandemic. I mean, obviously, just because physically when we were in the theater, we saw the actors wearing masks and we had to go through nasal swabs, and we know that there is this sanitization and all of that, that's part of the pandemic. But I think within the context of the play itself, there doesn't seem to be any references to that, and kind of maybe drawing, I don't know if that's what Kathy means, trying to draw a parallel between this pandemic we're in and, the world of climate change, and, what that that means for us. And, maybe they could have picked up on some of those parallels. We're living through a pandemic. There's this sense of despair. I think for me, it only crystallized in that one scene Shu spoke of about the two activists. That was the one scene where I think for me, everything kind of sort of moved and kind of made perfect sense. Like, the pandemic, the frustration, that sense of wanting to do something, but still being consumed by inertia. And, I think as Claire as well said, like, this is where the play becomes a lever to open so many other issues, not necessarily about climate change, but about the human condition, about privilege and inequality and how we just go about our lives. And I think for me, just for that 5 minutes of that scene, I saw myself reflected characters just lying in bed, trawling through social media, wanting something but not really wanting to. And I think I also picked on the fact that activists were in a pandemic. I think one was wearing a mask, so maybe that made it a bit more real for me as well.
I think Kathy is also talking, I feel that she's also might be talking about the idea of like the urgency. Did it create a sense of urgency that it's really the year of no return is coming, what are you going to do? And I feel like a lot of that was contained in Leanne Sutton's character, the quote unquote eco-terrorist. He was definitely like very fired up and very passionate. And in a certain way, like I feel like I wish, like, if you imagine it as like a ball, this sense of urgency, like that ball, I wish he passed it to me, to also feel fired up and to also feel like I want to do something, I want to at least stop using plastic bags, if not other things, right? But I feel like that ball like wasn't passed to the audience, or maybe like we have to do a lot more work to create that sense of urgency in ourselves a bit more.
Could I just add something to that?
Yes.
I think that another key thing about this performance is that it really, really, really depends on how each and every single one of us experience that discourse of like climate change and the pandemic. Like a lot of us here are in privileged positions, for instance. A lot of us might already be talking about these things. A lot of us might be already feeling very frustrated when you enter the theater. And then, of course, there are a lot of unfair expectations whenever we watch a show, right? But this one in particular, I feel really riles up the sort of polarizing, the sort of like distant, but also very close to home kind of questions that you have to ask yourself about what you as individuals want to do when it comes to the pandemic or the crisis of climate change or any sorts of like inequality or poverty related issues. Like, what do you want to do? And I think the reason why it got me frustrated, but at the same time, like I appreciated the show in that way, was that like theater, right? Like it has to show a mirror to society most times. And I think sometimes it's also quite damning to see yourself or not see yourself on stage, and you have to leave with that question of like, what am I going to do today? And I think it also boils back down to what we as individual audiences expect to come out of the theater feeling. Do we want to be moved into doing something? Do we even need theater to make us think that way? Or is theater just a way to help us clarify those thoughts? So yeah, I think that there are a lot of mixed emotions kind of baked into the year of no return, which is why it's quite a wonderful piece to kind of break open and kind of explore different point of views on.
I appreciate that this idea of like we all have different starting points in terms of like our education in climate change, and in a way then they didn't make an assumption that we didn't know anything, right? It wasn't a 101 for sure. So that's pretty interesting. Comment from Wei Liang. I'm wondering if for a multifaceted theme like climate change that is so interconnected with other social, economic, cultural issues like privilege, if a stage performance like the Year of No Return is an apt platform of the best means of unpacking all these issues. This is always a tricky question because then as critics, there's always this idea of like, should we think about what other presentations it should have been, right? It's a little bit tricky, but I have seen some people on social media saying things like, oh, could this have been blank? Could this have been, for example, an essay with all these different arguments? Naeem, I'm going to start with you. What do you think?
So, I mean, I think I actually agree with Wei Liang, because I mean, I felt this of a few productions before. And I think, firstly, more than half the scenes of this production were filmed. So, I came out of it thinking, oh, could this not have been an online experience? That's one. But I think also a show like this, and even Civilized, had a lot of information. I think someone mentioned information dump. There's almost this sense of like, just getting these little nuggets of information kind of given to you at specific points. And, that is quite academic in nature. And, could that have been done by means of a more interactive, maybe performance lecture, something like that? I mean, there's so many potential formats that it could have been on. I mean, not to say that, this format didn't work. I mean, I think there were things that resonated with all of us, but yes, I think I definitely could see this one perhaps work better, on an online only space.
I mean, that's quite interesting because you watched it on VOD.
Yeah.
Right. So did you feel like it worked better then?
I think it was more cohesive for me because I think everything was grounded. I had a perfect angle. I was not distracted. The space and the verticality and the three-dimensionality of the space, and me perhaps craning my neck to read subtitles, things which I would have experienced in the theater. And even scenes, I think there was this three bots communicating with each other, which I found very painful when I was in the theater, having to just read the text on the screen for about 5 minutes. But I think when it came onto my laptop, when I watched the VOD, it was actually a lot more easy to digest. So, scenes like that, the digital scene, filmic scenes, I think there was the film of the funeral, there was a film of the Filipino activist just kind of talking about his family being lost. All the beautiful filmic elements, kind of like I was able to appreciate them because they filled up the entire screen and I wasn't distracted by other things happening. So I think for me, it worked better when I saw it on the VOD.
I think there's a comment from Nian, and maybe we can wrap with this comment or question, which is that, like, in a way, like the Year of No Return, we can't fault it for being presented. We can't fault it for being presented this year and all the conditions in which it was being presented. So in this case, right, just saying something like, oh, more than 50% is pre-recorded or a film, like they can't help it, like those were the cast, right? And in a way, like that is trying to be like keep to the integrity or kind of ethical issues of keeping the cast that you have, that you kind of started working with for much longer. And we all know that TNS they do have their cast in for devising very early on, right? It's a kind of a extended process. So I'm wondering, maybe my question is like, are we being a little bit unfair in saying, oh, it should have been this, or oh, there was too much film, you know what I mean? Maybe just some kind of like closing thoughts from everyone.
I think my quick thought on this is that I was actually quite glad to have watched it live, because I think that if I had watched it, on my laptop, right, there would have been, it's the usual things like multiple distractions. I'll be looking at my phone or whatever. And because I'm just thinking that the first 15 or 20 minutes of the production, I wasn't really that immersed in it. It took some time. So actually the live environment helped me to really focus and actually drew me in more. I think I might have given up on it, within 15, 20 minutes if I had seen it on my laptop, right? While I do agree with my fellow panelists that the kind of like the live action, the live choreography was not the strongest suit of the production. But I thought the live and the multimedia was well integrated. I mean, in the scenes where a live, an actor on stage was acting with someone on screen, I did not feel this sense of disjunct in the way that I did watching Three Sisters. There was a context for the action. There was a dramatic logic, and the interplay was moving. Yeah. So I mean, on the whole, I was glad that I watched it in a live space. And yeah, I mean, who is to say? Yeah, I mean, what other forms it could have taken? Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated the dramatic logic of the Year of No Return. Shu, let's end with you. Your thoughts?
I think
responding to what you said about, these are the circumstances that we have been presented with. This is the type of work that, TNS was able to and was supposed to put out. And I think really kudos to them as well as to all the other theatre groups that have had to put out performances that were cancelled and postponed and then reshuffled and hybridized and stuff like that. I think it is what it is, and we would be doing like a lot of the theatre makers out there a big disservice if we said, no, you have to scrap this and kind of like change it completely just because we don't agree with that. I think this kind of like, I think this is what TNS would have wanted. Like they would have wanted that kind of like polarizing discourse and like have some sort of reaction come out of the people who have watched the show. I think for me, since it is on video, since there is the production in that reincarnation, I feel like this is an important work that can afford to go out to more than just usual theatre going audiences. Like if they're able to post it somewhere, share it with youth, share it with community groups, share it with people who, have a vested interest in this, I think they could definitely create that sort of ripple effect and achieve what that play was trying to achieve inside of that live space as well. So yeah, that's my position.
Thanks, Shu. Yeah, I think just to round off, I think what I really appreciated was the perspectives of the non-Singaporean kind of like non-privileged perspective that they did manage to delve into quite a bit as part of the play. And the fact that there was still a kind of that intercultural experiment of TNS could still be done, in these conditions. I feel like that's something to kind of applaud. Yes, so with that, we've come to the end of the panel and the Q&A and the discussion. But please feel free to leave your questions in the chat, and I'm sure we'll all be looking at it afterwards as well. The Year of No Return, of course, is still available on SIFA on demand from now till 20th June. So you still have about a week to watch it. And I am interested in catching it actually after this. You can check out the SIFA website for all the details of the show, as well as all the other shows that are available as well. And ArtsEquator will actually be doing another Critics Live session on the show Oiwa by the Finger Players, and that's on 12th of June. So do catch that as well. ArtsEquator would like to thank the Arts House and Singapore International Festival of Arts for inviting us to be part of their programs through the Asian Arts Media Roundtable. And if you want to find out more about that, you can visit our AAMR website for more details. With that, I thank you and have a good evening.